This is episode 8 of the Three Body Problem, a podcast on the Security Conversations Network. We are back this week with Juan Andres, checking in from home after a long and exciting trip to Las Vegas for Black Hat and DEF CON. How would you summarize your week out there, my friend?
Absolutely grueling and exhausting. Soul-crushing, perhaps.
Did we learn anything?
Not to go to Vegas, probably.
The
main learning.
I actually echo a lot of that. I believe this is my last trip out there, to be honest with you. I find that I was spending time in my hotel room looking to track the conference rather than run around Las Vegas casinos and hotel rooms. So we can talk about that a little later. Yeah. The other buddy checking in from Europe, Costin, Raiu. How are you, my friend? I hear you're on vacation again.
It's
not even funny, bro.
Thing.
Dude. Juanito, it's not funny. He's actually on vacation again.
I know, because you said checking in from Europe. I'm like, yeah, he's on vacation. It's appropriate.
Well, I'm not in Europe. I'm in Asia, actually. Like, if you want to be strict, Turkey, the Asian side of Turkey, I guess. But now, here's the thing. I mean, we're joking, but I do work from time to time. And we always record these sessions on Friday, like at 6 p.m. So usually at Friday, 6 p.m., I'm in vacation. I'm not working, like usually.
It's a mentality. It's a mentality.
We'll give you that out. From here, you're heading to HitCon in Taiwan to keynote the conference. What are you going to be talking there about?
I want to talk a bit about, I call it the Big Bang of cybersecurity emergencies. So I just want to dive a bit into how big emergencies happen and what we learn from dealing with all this over the years. You know, WannaCry, the recent Crowd2K thingy, but also there were a lot of big things over the years in cybersecurity, and I strongly believe that from every one of these emergencies we learn things. And I think it's up to us how to, take advantage of these teachings of learnings and how to implement and be aware of what we don't know. So, I still want to keep it as a surprise, but I believe that the slides and the talk will be made public afterwards. And I'm very excited because it's the first time for me. It will be in Taiwan, so first time for me in Taiwan. I hear it's very interesting. And the conference itself, HitCon, again, first time for me. And I hear it's a very interesting conference as well.
Can you go to the supermarket? Can you go to the supermarket?
I was just going to ask the same thing. I'm like, is there a tour of, like, can you go to TSMC and stuff? Like,
No. Go to Supermicro and see if you find a rice grain and bring back for me.
Everyone wants me, like, to bring back chips or what, grain of rice. The Bloomberg story, grain of rice from the Supermicro backdoor, the motherboard.
Exactly. We want to believe.
Exactly.
Or what the digitally signed Stuxnet drivers, right? Many other historical happenings in Taiwan.
Well, good luck with your keynote next week, my friend. Let's pivot to the big news. Obviously, the biggest news in cybersecurity today is the release of the LABScon speaker list.
Obviously, the biggest news. It's what everyone's talking about.
The LABScon speaker list was released yesterday. Pretty impressive list. Costin, again, you were on the program committee. Thank you for your help picking the agenda this year. A lot to talk about and a lot to kind of marinate as you go through the list of speakers there. Anything stand out there for you, Juan? Anything you wanted to flag quickly before we move on to the news?
I'm super excited about MJ's talk. She's sort of looking at a lot of these hardware appliances and how like the software has evolved over time, right? With all these acquisitions and whatnot. And I think I don't know what her findings are, but I have a feeling that it's going to be quite upsetting to some folks. Dakota Carey's got a great talk about like these Chinese hacking competitions and how those vulnerabilities are disseminating. Like there's a lot of great things. Kristen Del Rosso has like been at the top 3 speakers for the past 2 years. And like this one, she's speaking with Maddie DeVoe, and it's really interesting because sometimes like she'll submit these talks that don't look like cyber at all. Like they're about, going through document leaks and like going through available information about like property listings and whatnot. And like she just uncovers these like unbelievable things.
But it's real threat intel that connects back to a bunch of cyber and sanctions implications and all that stuff.
I mean, last year it was like, oh yeah, and here's this like ranch in the middle of America, and why is it why is it owned by three shell companies that have something to do with a Russian oligarch, and it like possibly being used for visas for like these random individuals? You're like, what the hell, man? Like it's really amazing. So I'm super excited about those.
We can find out on LABScon.io. LABScon.io, there's a speaker release list there. All right, let's pivot to the news quickly because we got a lot to get to. The big news this week, there's a lot of big news this week, but this was Patch Tuesday. And it was a hell of a Patch Tuesday. It was a monster Patch Tuesday. I feel like every vendor released patches this week. Obviously, the highlights was Microsoft acknowledging 6 new ODAs in the wild, already exploited ODAs. One of those that stood out to me, Costin, reported by OnLab and South Korea's National Cybersecurity Center. Is there, what do we make of directly connecting the reporter to what we believe the attack is? Because obviously, again, no IOCs. Microsoft does not release any sort of supporting evidence to help anyone with anything. So what are we guessing here?
Well,
this is not funny. I don't know why it's funny to you, dude. It's like, this is so ridiculous that it's that we have to repeat this week after week. But anyway, what do you make of this, Costin?
Typically, well, considering what SentinelLabs was saying, that this was found in targeting of South Korean companies, typically that kind of suggests North Korea is somehow involved. I mean, they are the most active, and over the years, they've been using 0 days to target South Korean companies. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about. Very little details, so nothing essentially about the others, but kind of scary, 5 other in the wild 0 days just patched with no details. Usually that's kind of scary. While the other, of course, quite interesting thing is the IPv6 patch from Microsoft, which I think everyone is talking about. I think before anything else, the best advice here is to just disable IPv6 as soon as possible if you are on Windows. I dare say, even if you're not on Windows, if you're on Linux, if you know that you don't use IPv6, my advice is to disable it. And actually, on a lot of our servers, back in the days, we just disabled IPv6 since we were not using it for safety reasons. Just less complexity, less attack surface, and so on.
I don't know anything about IPv6. Honestly, IPv6 implementations, it's beyond me. But I have seen some folks kind of commenting as far as the guidance to disable IPv6 that apparently there are some complexities when it comes to AD in certain environments where you shouldn't, right? It does seem like there's a lot of version specificity to whether you can realistically just go and shut this stuff off. So edge case there, maybe not that edge case, right?
I think we're talking about this. We're talking about this because Microsoft says it's wormable, basically. And exploit complexity is very low and exploitation is very likely. I mean, that CVS says 9.8 out of 10. It feels like they put up all the red flags that's necessary for people to scramble to patch this. But I'm seeing some chatter that it might not be reliably exploitable. I've seen some POCs starting to pop up with crashes. Costin, what do we know about, obviously disabling IPv6 is the major mitigation, but what do we know about exploitability?
Well, the other thing you need to keep in mind here is that with older things like, worms spreading by randomly hitting IPv4 addresses, that's feasible because the IPv4 space is relatively small, right? And that means that any piece of malware can just randomly target IP addresses on the internet, IPv4, and every now and then be successful. I mean, hit a real system if they're doing purely random based. With IPv6, it's completely different. The possibility of having a computer malware, a worm, self-replicating worm, randomly finding live IPv6 addresses on the internet is pretty small because the space is so large, so big. So I guess the solution here, for someone who was working, let's say, writing something like this, would be just to target IPv6 equivalents of IPv4 numbers. So pretty much every IPv4 address has an IPv6 equivalent that can be derived.
Right.
So yeah, you can target those instead. So those that's one of the complexity. The other one I would say IPv6 is maybe more popular in Asia. I think that originally it was Japan, China that were really pushing for IPv6 because they were running out of IP addresses, and IPv4 addresses are actually expensive. So if you wanted, let's say, to own like a class of IPv4 addresses, that may actually be quite expensive. While on the other hand, IPv6, yeah, that's there's a lot of addresses out there, so it's cheap to own them.
Juan, what does disabling IPv6 mean in terms of affecting operating system? Is there any sort of...
I'm really not the best person to ask this question because, frankly, so I've spent
Why
so
is
much
it
time
enabled by default if you have to disable it?
I think there's always been this sort of specter of hope that like IPv6 was the next frontier. Like we are going to run out of IPv4. So look, IPv6 is there and like that's the next thing. And why haven't we taken it up? But listening to people who are far more competent in this space when it comes to networking, it does seem like IPv6 is dogged by horrible issues when it comes to like actual implementations of IPv6 as opposed to like the spec itself. And it just seems like this weird futuristic appendage that we're holding on to, but that I'm not sure to what extent it is actually in use. It seems to be more in use in specific types of environments, certain regions, certain kinds of devices, but it isn't necessarily a thing that, it has not replaced IPv4 in the way that you would expect. And that's the extent of my knowledge about IPv6, to be perfectly honest.
Costin, what relies on this? I mean, the question is, what does disabling it potentially break? Is there any risk of just disabling it across the board?
Well, if you're not running an enterprise environment, I think there's probably little that you can break. I've been running my computers on Windows with IPv6 disabled for many, many years and never had any issues, essentially.
Right.
So no problems for me.
Influencer.
A funny story that I remember once, we were looking into a command and control side of, I think it was a malware used by an APT group, and it was quite interesting that the command and control side of things was actually logging the victim IP addresses in a text file. And as we were going through the text file, just to identify the victims, notify certs in different countries, I noticed that some of the victims had IPv6 addresses, and the command and control side of things was written in PHP, and it was like didn't even know that the remote victims are actually IPv6. So it was like all transparent from their point of view, which to me it sounded very impressive. It almost sounded like, look at these victims, they're running on IPv6 and they don't even know, the CNC doesn't know, and everything just works. They're still victims. So I thought that was quite impressive.
I looked at the acknowledgements for this vulnerability and found that it was reported by Wei in Kunlun Lab with a company called Cyber Kunlun, Kunlun. On Twitter, this researcher said that he reported it to Microsoft, quote unquote, several months ago. Obviously, there's the conspiracy Ryan's hackles flew up in the air.
The tinfoil hat just comes right out.
There's a new vulnerability disclosure law in effect in China that mandates cybersecurity companies and researchers to submit these bugs within a couple of days and way ahead of them being reported. Cyber Kunlun is actually listed as a supporter of this MIIT database. Shout out to Dakota Carey for flagging that on Twitter.
Which is why they're not in prison.
The natural suggestion, Costin, or it's not crazy. It's obvious. If they follow the law, it meant that the Chinese government had access to this for quote unquote several months. What does that mean? Does that mean we're likely to have this might have been already exploited? What do you worry about?
Well, I guess one of the questions here is exactly what was reported. Did he just report, let's say, there's a vulnerability there? Like, what is the kind of details that went into the report? I mean, obviously there's a lot of very, very advanced Chinese APT groups with the ability to develop 0 days from scratch. So I think there's like absolutely no problem there. And for
You
sure
think
there
he
are.
wouldn't report his own, like he wouldn't have to add his own POC? Like, come on. Like,
Yeah, there's like,
it's not
again, there's
nefarious.
levels. There's levels
It's not
of POC,
nefarious on
right?
their part, right? Like
There's
the guy, if you live in China and you have, this is the local law, right? Like what happens with it, of course, we can impugn the Chinese government, not the researchers themselves who just want to do their
Following
job
the law,
and they're
yeah.
following the law. So like I would expect them to provide a POC, to provide the whole thing.
True,
right?
true. But remember that even in the United States, there's companies that the big three-letter agencies employ to turn like a POC into a reliable exploit. Like sometimes a POC is nothing but a few lines of code that will just blue screen Windows. And that's like just the starting point, turning that a few lines that just blue screen Windows into reliable code execution, remote code execution, weaponized, military grade, if you want, malware server replicating worm or APT tool. I think it takes a bit of energy and time. If it was me, like in this position, I would provide like the worst possible POC, like just to comply with the law. But at the same time, I would try to sell the fully reliable chain in parallel and somehow try to do this at the same time. I mean, that's what I would do.
Wait a second, slow down. Why are you going this? When did profitability take control of your life, my friend?
No, I mean, I said if it was me, like doing this kind of 0 day exploitation
prison.
in China, of course.
Gotcha. No, in all seriousness,
prison.
in all seriousness, there is an official Microsoft report I want to guess 6-8 months ago that clearly linked the surge in 0 day discoveries and the surge in O days that we've seen over the past few years to this law and to the fact that there's some stockpiling happening in China, and it's clear that there's some APT activity linked to this. The idea that a ping of death bug can land in their laps, and the Chinese government not having the skills and the resources to pounce on it and figure out even from a bad POC is just being naive, though.
Were I a better researcher, more interested in this particular topic, I would be curious to just go, like, is there scanning data available for what the IPv6 space looks like in China and how much it has changed? Like the public IPv6 space, how much has it changed over the past 6 months? Like, I think that would be a really telltale sign of how much coordination there actually is between these vulnerabilities being reported to the Chinese government and them actually being effectively used for policy and dissemination. Because I think that's a part where, look, pushing something as a quartermaster across your different APT teams is one thing. Like being able to take a tool and exploit whatever and say, okay, I'm going to hand it off to all these different APTs and they're going to figure out how to use it. Fine. Like we saw that during Hafnium. We understand that there is some relationship there between all these different teams. It's different to say, hey, we know that there's this like wormable, packet of death kind of situation. Do the Chinese go out and actually instruct people or get people or change, since they have such a intricate setup with sort of the Great Firewall, do they change what the public IPv6 space looks like within their own borders? Or is
as
there
a
just
mitigation
like,
for this
right,
based on this knowledge, right?
exactly, right? Like I think that's one case where I know that there's a lot more intricacies to scanning things within China, and I would defer to some folks that I know that spend a lot of energy trying to work on these sorts of things. But I am really curious, if you had historical data of what that space looks like, can you tell the difference between, 6 months ago, there's this many publicly accessible IPv6 addresses and systems live versus after the reporting of this vulnerability? I think that's one of those few cases where you could maybe measure the mean time and the actual response of this government.
I think it will also be very interesting to see if, let's say, right now somebody tried to exploit this vulnerability against an IP address in China, and determine if the Great Firewall of China actually cuts the packet, if they have the ability to recognize that as an exploit and cut it. That would be very interesting to test.
That would be super interesting.
Great thought. What are we expecting here? You expecting this to land in the hands of APTs? If a bug, an exploit for a bug like this in the hands of APT is not really interested in wormability. Wormability is too noisy and distracting. The remote code execution gives you access to the machine anyway. Costin, just a quick guess. You expect we'll see this as form of APT arsenal, or you think people will scramble to patch and there's just enough mitigations around that this becomes kind of one of those things that goes away?
I think we'll have to wait and see. I think there's a lot of factors here. One of them being, as Juan was saying, many different IPv6 implementations, and the fact that in this case, I think it relies on this jumbo frames feature of IPv6, and we'll have to see if pretty much routers across the internet actually comply with that, and they, fully respect the protocol and forward the packets further on and so on. I mean, there's many other things, let's say on the internet, for instance, IP route recording, which is a very interesting feature. But for instance, many routers across the internet, they just drop this whenever a packet goes through them. So they don't just follow and keep the route recording feature on. They just wipe it and pass the packet without that. The other thing I was thinking about IPv6 is the fact that, big companies like Google are, reportedly just not using even IP anymore inside their own networks. They completely switch to other custom protocols replacing IP, which in reality, IP, let's be honest, is a very, very old protocol. What is like 40, 50 years old. Maybe it's time for a kind of a refresh with like more modern options. I don't know, maybe integrity compression, encryption built in. Let's say none of these things are built into the current version of IPv6, I guess.
So you see a rewrite, innovation around rewriting this protocol from scratch. Maybe you're just kind of going in a completely different direction as something that's feasible in the long term.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when Cloudflare announced Warp that they were using UDP extensively, so like just dropping TCP and using UDP instead. I thought that was interesting for performance reasons. And like more modern protocols that Google is using also relying on UDP. So at some point you have to ask what is more important, like speed. Is like the speed is the most important thing on the internet, and protocols should be tweaked in order to accommodate the speed needs of today. Or is it security or reliability, or maybe we just figure reliability, that's not a problem anymore, and the only thing we need is speed.
Maybe they're all the same. Maybe they're all the same. Security, reliability, and
look at what you're describing, right? Like the environment where that can actually apply is somewhere like Google, where you're talking about them owning the entire stack, top to bottom.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, it's ideal. That's the conversation usually comes whenever we talk about like how messed up the internet is in a variety of ways. Ad tech, the general security of, comms, SSL, all that kind of stuff. You're like, well, it wasn't written to be secure. It was written to just work as a POC. Okay, yeah, so someday we need to rewrite it. And everybody just looks at each other and goes, yeah, this is never going to happen. But you do, I guess I'd never considered that you basically have these like dark nets that are privately owned at a global scale, right? Like Google running its own cables, running its own data centers, running its own stacks. Like you do have these special little enclaves where that kind of magic can be tested and played with. And hopefully it means that someday a very well-tested standard can come down from a place like that and say, oh yeah, we've been using this for 7 years. It works amazingly. Like, let's see how we can start re-rolling portions of what people use on the internet. I mean, it gives me some hope, right?
Way to be optimistic out there, Juan.
Right?
Give me a good vibe on a Friday. I like that.
I got you,
I
man.
like that. I'm just fascinated that there's a patch Tuesday with 6 days, CISA known exploited vulnerabilities list, warn people to go patch some new SolarWinds thing that's already been exploited. And we're talking about IPv6. We're talking about IPv6 because there's no IOCs and no one can do anything about it. And no one, there is no clarity on what's the big story today. Hi.
Can I
Anyway,
drop a last question, like at the end of this
yes.
IPv6
Costin
discussion?
question.
Hit it.
Not saying it's my idea or my question, just something I saw on the internet these days and in the past a lot of times, which is that what is, in your opinion, like the probability that when you report one of these 0 days to Microsoft, that actually in just a day or two, it lands in the hands of three-letter agencies?
Well, let's
I
talk about
wish.
it. Let's talk about it. Juan, does it? I mean, isn't there is some element of information sharing, equities information sharing between things when it's like critical infrastructure, national security at risk. I imagine there has to be some protocol to pass information.
Dude, Microsoft doesn't give a. Microsoft doesn't even try to. Microsoft has not tried to protect the three-letter agencies when they're getting hacked through Microsoft's own
Well,
services.
That's fair.
But they
That
don't
is
know.
entirely
Like,
fair.
They got a
they haven't tried
notification.
with
They're
it, they
still
don't
getting
know.
notification emails. Like maybe they're gonna get an email about the APT29 thing at some point in the coming weeks.
Hey, listen, here's the thing. Microsoft as an independent player broker in this doesn't fit in my mind. They're just not an independent player broker. They're just too well embedded with, selling to government. They're just too
that's
important
the
to national
outrage.
security. They're just too important to
No.
critical infrastructure for them to be viewed
You're
as this
looking at
entirely...
it backwards. You're looking
you're
at it
wrong.
backwards. No, dude, it's a too big to fail type situation. They're
Correct, that's
so
my point.
critical. They're so critical that they don't do any of that shit.
No.
And nobody has any access to doing anything.
Let me ask you a question, Costin. Let's say this bug gets reported to you. Let me ask you the same question you just asked me. This exact bug gets reported to Microsoft, and they've been sitting on it for several months. Do you think that doesn't get passed to somewhere important that needs to protect a system from an exploit?
Well, I'm not saying this is how things work at Microsoft, but this is like how things work in general in other places, other countries. But a lot of
I don't
people,
like when you frame I don't like when you frame your answer like that. Just tell the people what
Out
you want to
here
tell
in
them.
Europe, in
Well,
vacation land,
here in Asia, where I am now, typically
ahead.
people who do all the high-end work on these 0 days, they have a background from three-letter agencies. So they previously worked in some kind of high places, you name it. And they have friends. They still have friends there. So the first thing they'll do probably is just like drop a
Back
message
channel.
to their old friends. Like you won't gonna believe what just landed in our hands today. And then just
Guys,
like leak
turn off
some
IPv6.
details.
Trust me, turn off
but that's
IPv6
the back
kind of thing,
channel.
right?
That's the back channel. That's not Microsoft.
That doesn't
That's
mean the
not.
information isn't being passed properly, though.
Yeah, but
that's the
we're
purpose
talking
of back
about two
channels.
completely different things, right? There's the back channel where I call up my buddy and I go, hey, you'll never believe what we just found. You might want to try to leverage this. Then there's Microsoft as a company having some nefarious tie-in where they're gonna hit up the NSA and go, you're gonna love this O-Day.
Well, it's not
until we're done
nefarious.
patching
It might not be nefarious. It might just be doing its part as a player
Look, I'd like to think so, but I do think there's something nefarious when you talk about the maintainer, the defender enabling the attackers in certain situations. Particularly, it's not like there isn't a history there, right? Like the NSA Microsoft Eternal Blue contention is a perfect corollary of this situation that you're describing. But to be honest, I think this is touching on a bigger problem, which is why whenever Microsoft acts in a way that's kind of callous towards defense, you see a lot of us bitching about like where the hell's FedRAMP and like what's the point of government certifications for like government sales. And that's why I was making the point so strongly before, Ryan, that like I don't think. I think conspiracy brain and even like business brain suggests that that's what should be happening. But the fact that it isn't is where it becomes drastically reprehensible in some ways. Not that they're not gifting O-days to the NSA or whomever, but rather that even when it comes to the defense of the government, who is ostensibly one of their biggest customers and part of what makes them too big to fail, they're not doing what's necessary to actually proactively defend that government. Like government people are pissed off about, the APT29 thing and a bunch of other sort of intrusions and how poorly Microsoft handled those situations from a defense standpoint, from a just like calling up and saying, hey, there's something really wrong. We're trying to figure it out, right? Like, it's not that like, I'm trying to catch a bullet for you, buddy. Like, yeah, some things went wrong, but like we're trying, like that is not the relationship that is there as far as we can tell.
Well, you're not asking for it to be official either. You're not asking, let's be careful, let's be clear about what we're asking for. Are we asking for Microsoft and the NSA to have like an official channel where they formally pass things across?
Well, I'm sure they do have one, and I don't think it's being used appropriately as far as I can tell, but look, I don't know. Who the hell knows?
Listen,
I don't know
there's going to be a bunch of people who know a lot about this stuff that's going to be fact-checking us. I'm just like, this is my own conspiracy brain.
I hope so. But also, I don't know that they would be able to tell us if they did. But I will say, like, you can see it in the outcomes that isn't necessarily happening. And what I will say, Ryan, is I think that the issue here, when you scope out to what the larger problem is with, like, these mega corporations and the U.S. in particular, is what we're seeing is all the big companies seem to be far more interested, far more willing to kowtow to the Indian government, the Chinese government, because it threatens market share. And they just don't bother with the U.S. government because at no point is the U.S. government going to come out and be like, okay, stop selling your fucking phones in the U.S. then. That's not going to happen at all. So they just don't bother. And they're far more concerned with like, well, is Modi going to be cool with us releasing this report? And that's what we're seeing. Like there's a chilling, that this is one thing I'll say for any journalists that are listening. There is a chilling of research into China that, I mean, China has been the like APT like punching bag for 10 years, and it was cool to release anything on China, and you can say anything about China. That is changing. A lot of big companies are starting to tell their researchers to stop pointing the finger at China, to shut up about all these big Chinese campaigns, about the Uyghur persecution. Western companies are telling them to stop pointing the finger in that direction. And frankly, it's not arbitrary. Their manufacturing bases are in China. They're worried about how this is actually going to affect not a small part of the bottom line. And we've been discussing this since the like horrible Apple response to the whole Uyghur Ode situation, where you go, wow, that was callous and that's bullshit. But also, if the Chinese shut down, Apple's manufacturing in China for a week, what happens to that $1 trillion behemoth?
Yeah, I'll go
right?
one
It's not
further.
A small problem.
I'll go one further, and I think Tom Hegel flagged this in his last talk at LABScon. The Chinese government was caught compromising a government network in Guyana. And the Guyana government not only refused to acknowledge it, but upbraided the reporters for asking about this thing. Like, how dare you question anything about China? And they're the victims.
Same thing in Kenya. Same thing happened in Kenya.
There's a lot of that chilling effect being pushed down across the world in some of those non-traditional places where we see APT. So it's just fascinating.
I mean, there's soft power and then there's power, right? Like, I think we've gotten so used to this Bretton Woods, like soft power, soft influence. I'll give you a little money. I'll cut you a nice deal. And we've forgotten the part where like a far, stronger, more authoritative government can legitimately strong arm you. Right, like, and look at the American company pullout of Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. It was not an eager.
It was
pullout.
Performative, yeah.
It was performative. Some of them slow rolled it. Some of them tried not to, and it wasn't until it wasn't until like you really hand your hand force. You're like, fine, fuck this market, right? Like, but it's not an eager, nationalistic, principled stance. No, absolutely, there's no room for that.
But when we talk about Microsoft and information sharing, like how did we regularize getting to a point where there are no IOCs for 6 days? I mean, isn't transparency a big part of the purity pledge? Isn't transparency a big part of secure by default, secure by design? Like they call for it explicitly. They call for it explicitly. Vendors should release information to help people manage threats and so on. Like, why are we allowing these big vendors with billions of dollars in revenue to get away with this shit and still try to go on stage at Black Hat at Keynote and talk about Secure Futures Initiative and all this shit? It really aggravates me. Anyway.
I mean, honestly, I have a bigger problem with how poorly they're doing it as a business. Like, look, I've bitched infinitely about there not being any IOCs, and you beat me to the punch when we talk about the Iranian like election hacking, whatever. Like, there's a clear, stark difference between the Google tag report and the Microsoft MTAG report, particularly on the IOC side. But I'll say this. What bugs me most about Microsoft not releasing IOCs is that they don't seem to be effectively making it a business either. And I know
Right.
people who have the money on hand and they're like, how do I buy all this Microsoft knowledge? And everyone just kind of stares at each other and like looks around and like, where the
Be
fuck are the
careful what you're asking for, though.
salespeople?
Every time you say this, I say, be careful what you're asking for.
It's just like it's not that I think it's not that it's what I want. It's that at least that would make sense to me.
It would justify it, right?
It would justify. You're like, oh yeah, you're just too poor to have it. Ha ha ha. And like, fine, okay, fine. But that doesn't seem to be the case either. Like, there doesn't seem to be like an effective skew for you to actually go buy this information. So you're like, okay, you're keeping it from everybody. You're not selling it. You're just assholes, right? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing?
I'll go a step further to Costin's rule. Costin had a rule on the podcast, which is no IOCs, no story. To journalists, no IOCs, no story. And you followed up, Juan, saying, yes, write stories, write a damn negative story, calling them out on this. And I think I'm on your side here, where whenever we see this stuff, like on Patch Tuesday, every story should have said, Microsoft, as is customary, did not release IOCs, and defenders are left to just patch and guess or hope that they weren't infected.
I agree with that because they don't want a story. Right? Like, the problem, the previous one we were talking about, it was Drago's trying to milk the wartime situation and not providing IOCs. So they want the story, but they're not providing anything to verify their work. In the case of these O-Days and whatnot, it's because they don't want a story. They just want to sail by. And frankly, we're giving Microsoft a really hard time, but Apple is far worse at this. How many patches have come from Apple? This may have
been exploited.
Somewhere, someone might have used it.
Massively exploited.
Massively.
Exploited.
But maybe massively exploited. Maybe. And then they just like give you the patch. And also we fixed the fonts. And you're like, fuck off.
Well, in the interest of balance, Costin, is there any risk to releasing IOCs in a way where it enables the offensive team more than the defensive team? Like, is there any world where Microsoft sits back and says, hey, you and your IOCs, do you understand that releasing IOCs puts XYZ in certain people's hands? Is there that major risk?
I would say that all the advantages outweigh the risks. There are for sure a few small risks, such as, just to give a random example, if they release a hash of a tool, right? Some bad guys might actually find that tool and reverse engineer and either just use it like it is, if you want, or just rewrite it and use it by themselves. So there is a little bit of risk. But what would be, I think, useful in my opinion, is releasing IOCs, which put like almost no risk or zero risk. Just to give you an example, maybe to release for some kind of, let's say, escalation of privilege exploit, just say this group, whatever the group name was, something Storm, Blizzard, Rain, was using this 0 day. And here's like some IOCs for that group, which is related to the target. Yeah, the infrastructure.
Tell us the infrastructure.
Exactly.
Most people don't need the hash of the tool necessarily, but they do need to know that this is being leveraged from these IPs.
Correct.
Ryan, I mean, to your broader question, yeah, I could see points at which the releasing the IOC might be problematic, where it's like, look, we're pointing you directly to the exploit or whatever. However, do keep in mind, in most cases, not this IPv6 one, but most of these cases, the vuln research people are going to go diff the patch and find the vuln
Pretty
anyway.
trivial now with the tools we have for different
every patch Tuesday, exploit Wednesday has been a thing for a long time and will continue to be. So I don't think that there's much of a justification, especially for contextual IOCs, where you could say, look, this is the threat that you're dealing with, regardless of what the O-Day will be.
All right. Well, keep beating the drum until Microsoft changes their stance. I mean, this is
Any
what
minute
works,
now.
guys.
In
all seriousness, this stuff works. I mean, I've seen them respond to feedback and kill Microsoft Windows recall, this AI trash thing. So this stuff works, and it's important for us. I mean, this is all we have at this point. It's just our opinions and our thoughts.
Just bitching. We'll just keep bitching until morale improves.
Let me pivot to the other thing. There's been, and you just teased it perfectly, Juan, is Iran being aggressively being, how do you describe it? A lot of public reports on Iran hacking activities linked to influence ops against the US elections. The Trump campaign actually came out and acknowledged that they were notified by law enforcement that they were a victim to this. The journalists are treating it the way they treat it. There's a big cyber angle here, obviously. First off, what do we make? There are two big reports. Microsoft report on this Mint sandstorm and Google tag that you just mentioned on increased spear phishing attempts on US and Israeli targets. How are we to believe everything we've read so far?
There's a lot out there. I really want to put like a massive crowbar here between our discussion of the Google tag report and the Microsoft MTAC report. And it particularly because of what we were just discussing. You look at the Google tag report, there's IOCs, and moreover, there's a description of the framework and the activities that are taking place when you're being directed to places. And frankly, I think that's an improvement on a lot of the tag stuff we'd seen before.
Yeah,
where
you've
they
been
would
harsh
say,
on tag on this podcast.
well, look, I'll be harsh on anyone. I'll be harsh on my own team whenever I can. I think we need to call things the way they are. And I think tag had a really bad tendency in the past to just say something bad's happened. Here's 3 hashes. Bye. And like it almost felt like someone had the right intention, and by the time it made it through 7 filters and 14 lawyers, like you had 4 blurbs left, and it was pointless. And that's not what's happening now. Like they did a great report. They described, what's being done, what kind of frameworks they've seen, and IOCs. And like I thought that was fantastic, right? That's excellent. You're actually not only are you substantiating this semi-political narrative, but you are giving people an indication of how to check your work, how to expand on that, how to move further. So excellent work by TAG. And that stands in direct opposition to this Microsoft MTAC report. And I keep calling it the MTAC report because...
What is MTAC?
Exactly. I have no fucking clue what MTAC is. The same way, and I say it because we've seen this happen before, right? Like Microsoft has Mystic. Mystic is one of the top research teams on the planet and will continue, hopefully, to be one of the top research teams on the planet. When Mystic comes out and says something, you believe them and you get excited and you follow up and you take that shit to the bank. Then Microsoft will randomly create the Digital Crimes Unit, the MTAC whatever, and some random people will just come and spit out a bunch of crap with no verifiable indicators, nothing to substantiate their claims, and they're always broad sweeping. Oh, they make big statements about like kinetic and cyber coordination, big statements about like disinformation effects and whatever. And you're like, I appreciate how much you're doing for the policy circles that will take this shit and like will not shut up about it for the next 6 months, but I don't know that I believe you. I don't appreciate that you're building off of the trust that we have in Mystic, even though they are not in any way related as far as, at least as far as the paper suggests with this thing. So I look at it suspiciously. To me, this is more like, this is probably this like Miboro thing that just popped up out of nowhere, that like bizarre acquisition. Now it has I'm going to guess it has its own name. People can correct me if I'm wrong. And then here we go with this massive report where like, if you pay attention to it, the red flag from the beginning needs to be the fact that this looks like a trends report, because we're talking about Iran, but they went Iran, Russia, China, team. These are their targets. These are all the things. Like, that's wonderful. Thank you for like the omnibus threat landscape perspective. However, how much of this is substantiated in any way? Because it isn't in this report. So where once right back to where do I go to get the real work on this?
I started this off by asking you, are we to believe what we're reading there? Costin, what are we to believe as it relates to actual Iranian cyber activity? Has there been a spike? How would you describe what you know and what we know about this?
Well, I think they've always been active. And going back to 2020, Iran was very heavily targeting the Biden campaign, and they've been kindly, associated with targeting elections in the United States for many, many years, going back maybe as far as 2015, if I remember correctly, for Ep8 35. But also, I mean, historically super active in Israel as well, in addition to the United States. I think it would be still interesting. Maybe you guys know better than me. If Google's APT42 and the mean sensor there, are they the same thing or are they like two different things? Can you comment on that, maybe Juan?
I can't say that without Googling, and I'm not allowed to type during these recordings. So
Because you have one of those stupid keyboards that make like a ton of noise.
excuse me, sir. I have 30 of those stupid keyboards.
He's banned. To the audience, just let the audience know he's banned from typing during the podcast. So he's sitting there with fiddling his fingers nonstop.
I think there's an interesting angle here, which is, well, I think Google says APT42, you know, they're like a standalone threat actor. They're different from the other Iranian groups, like, I don't know, Charming Kitten, for instance, or APT35. But like maybe other companies, depending on their visibility, consider them the same as like older threat groups, which brings us back, I think, to the question, like, what is a group? Is it the same group? Is it like different groups?
Imagine, I gotta interrupt
and so on.
you. The fact that you and Juan have to freaking search
Google,
the internet
right?
and ask each other if there's any doesn't this tell you
why?
what defenders have to
tell
deal
you
with?
why. Because of this new Microsoft nomenclature.
Exactly.
Like, that's a
You think
issue.
they ruined it?
Yeah, with this
Well, let's
marketing
talk about
bullshit
it.
of like arbitrarily renaming all these teams to like these idiotic
Phosphorus.
fucking
But
not to mention.
But not like
they-
the previous names were any useful anyway. Nobelium versus Storm
Phosphorus.
Mint is
Well, multiple things there. Multiple. You had look. We were tracking. We at least understood what strontium and phosphorus, or whatever, were supposed to be. You didn't arbitrarily decide to sprinkle some marketing on it. And more importantly, you don't adopt in like 2023. You adopt a naming convention that commits the cardinal sin of APT naming conventions, which is to put attribution in the name. The like dumbassery of fancy bear versus, you know, whatever panda, which is really, look, man.
why
coming from a
is that bad?
Because what happens when I write a report on, you know, obese bear today and realize that it's not Russian tomorrow, and I go, oh no, my bad, it's a Chinese team, and you go, okay, so is it obese panda
obese
now?
panda.
You're like, well, we spent all this marketing time on it, the SEO is gonna get messed up, so it's just gonna stay, you know, obese bear. It is the dumbest thing you can do to bake the attribution into the one unique identifier. You don't fucking do that.
But because you're hedging against being wrong? I mean,
Because you have to accept that you will be wrong at some point. We all get things wrong at some point. And if the important thing is the object of study,
but these reports are not for you, Juan. These reports are for defenders who look at it and see, what is it?
no.
Sandstorm?
What
I see
defender's
Sandstorm
getting
and say,
anything out of this shit? What, they're going to take the IOCs and do something with them?
Let me play devil's advocate. Let me put my Redmond hat on and say, listen, I'm not writing this stupid report for you. I'm writing this report for a defender who wants to know that Mint Sandstorm is from XYZ country. I'm a constant target from those guys. Let me pay extra attention to this thing. Or, I don't know. I feel like hitting them for, like, why, Costin, go back and answer your own question. Why is this naming, why is Microsoft misnaming ruined everything?
Well, let me go back, I mean, a couple of years and tell you that in the old days, we were very careful when naming malware, like, let's say, following a couple of rules. One of the rules was you don't name that malware, let's say, using the name that the author intended. Like, you don't want to give them any kind of satisfaction. You don't want to give them any kind of credit. So if they want to call their, I don't know, their malware, the star malware, you call it the mud malware. Like, it's completely the opposite. So they'll get very pissed and upset. And the other thing was you don't want to like use all these kind of fancy, flashy names for the malware. On the contrary, you want to use boring, stupid names so that, again, you don't attract the attention. And I thought it was like super, super interesting. I saw a news article covering the speech of Jan Esterly from Black Hat. I don't know if you guys attended that speech, but essentially she was saying, like, you know, Mandy and Google, they just use this APT and two numbers. Like, which brings basically zero attention. It's like not a super scary,
Also brings
flashy
zero
kind of a name.
value. It brings zero value to me. Who gives a shit if it's
Negative,
42 or 45?
like it doesn't. Let's say,
Oh, you think that's a feature?
respect them.
You think no
I
value
think,
is a feature?
yeah, I mean, and she was saying the other, like the opposite, was saying that, there's companies out there calling these things mean sandstorm or like a scattered spider, and then they have like these huge statues or models, 3D printed models of the scattered spider on their stands or booths at Black Hat. So I thought that she has a point. I thought that she has a point. I don't know if you guys saw her talk or if you have any comments about that, but I thought it was interesting that she was getting into this nomenclature thingy.
Look,
know,
I personally dislike the numbered names because I have a hard time remembering what's what, but I don't object to the numbered names. They're unique identifiers. You can work with them, and they're meant to be clusters, and that's fine. I can Google APT35 every single time and then try to remember what the fuck it is. I object to what we were just discussing, right? Like baking an intelligence assessment of variable confidence into the name. But you brought up the scattered spider thing and like the statues and the action figures and all that shit. Particularly when it comes to like, this is where marketing has like kind of lost the plot.
Your industry has gone marketing, my friend. You're pouring fuel on your own industry.
My industry has lived and fed off of marketing, and I don't necessarily object to that because we're having a very hard time figuring out who wants to pay for my industry in the first place. So if marketing is what's going to do it, that's fine. But what you mentioned, scattered spider, and that's a particular one that like just channeling Allison Nixon here. I don't think there's anything all that cute about glorifying a group of like sextortionists, child abusers, CSAM, child sexual material peddling assholes, as if they're like some wonderful, action movie star from the Marvel universe. Like, that shit is not cute, and none of us think it's cute. And only people who are too ignorant about what that fucking group is would think that it's awesome to own an action figure or see a mega display about this cutesy spider. Those dudes are a bunch of dicks. So, like, those are the moments where you see the most naked version of the marketing just getting too far ahead of itself and not really knowing what it's doing.
Speaking of naked version of marketing, are we going to mention very, very briefly this Palo Alto putting lampshades on women in evening gowns at their event? I mean, we've come a long way from boot babes being everywhere, and I think it's really sad.
Maybe we've come too far away from it, right? Like the fact that you can have a marketing person who has forgotten the drama. Right? Like, look, we do this every time. This is the third year of LABScon. You have been part of the planning committee every year. How many times do you hear me yelling at the hotel going, we need shots, people, not shot girls.
Fully dressed,
we need fully fucking dressed
costumes,
people handing out drinks. I don't give a shit what their gender is. Please, for the love of Christ, don't treat this like a bachelor party. And you're like fighting with these different places because that's what's common for other industries. It's what's okay for, whatever other bullshit events. But like, you have to put effort into it. I think what's curious about this is what's happening in Palo Alto's marketing department. Like, who are the new folks that have clearly never been around this thing, who just don't know the subculture? Because let's be fair, right? We as an industry are hypersensitive to it, and we do our best to make this space more like accommodating to women, minorities. So like, we're very self-conscious about it. But if that CMO went to work in literally any other space, the lampshade booth babes would have been fun, right? Like, so what's happening there?
Shout out to Palo Alto CEO for jumping on and issuing a public apology, releasing a letter, and basically saying, I mean,
let's
this gets swept under. Yeah.
While we're on the subject of class acts, shout out to CrowdStrike president for going to take that Pony Award. I thought that was fucking awesome. I thought it was great to see him step up there, look, we've given them so much shit. We have to give them credit. when you see the president himself step up there, go, hey, thank you for the reminder, then we fucked up, and taking the award and leaving.
It's not hard to do. Believe me, it's not hard to do. They're not the first to do it at Point
Ryan,
209.
it's not hard to do, but you don't have to do it. And most companies don't do it.
It's very good PR. Look at you. You got caught by it. It's
I went to receive the Google tag pony for supporting terrorist O-days or whatever.
Just to age myself a little bit. I age myself a little bit. The celebrated Dan Kaminsky, rest in peace, actually got a most overhyped bug one year at the ponies. At the same year when he was on the front page of USA Today and the front page of every major newspaper, he got a most overhyped bug award. He showed up to accept it and was pretty pissed about it, but he showed up and accepted it and made his message. That stuff, I'm not going to give CrowdStrike any benefit for showing up there. It's not a difficult thing to do. In fact, if you show up there, they're going to applaud it. So why not just show up and be applauded?
I agree with you that it's the right move, but how many companies would not do it? How many companies would look at the security space and be like, fuck you kids, what we care about is our mega enterprise market?
I thought you were going to say shout out to CrowdStrike for showing up at Black Hat, and I thought you were going to talk about the CEO himself showing up at the Innovation Summit and answering questions from Jeff Moss up front. That happened at an event before, and he has been very, very visible around the Black Hat show floor answering questions and dealing with people. He didn't have to be there. Listen, he's a CrowdStrike CEO, and he probably should have been in more important meetings sorting things out. But the fact that CrowdStrike was there, I give them some credit for that. And let me pivot quickly because we got to talk about this just a little bit. The Qihoo guys released a report saying, hey, this thing might be exploitable. This thing might be exploitable for LPE or remote code execution. Adam Myers issued a technical report right after that said, hey, not at all. There are no conditions here. We got a new report from IONESCO. We had the CrowdStrike RCA root cause analysis. There's a lot of technical documentation out of CrowdStrike. On this show, we have discussed their kind of quirky way of describing things and leaving us all confused. Can we wrap up now on the Qihoo 360 claim of exploitability and CrowdStrike's denial? Costin, who do we believe?
When I don't want to get sued, so I'll be very politically correct here. And
That'll
I'll say
ruin the vacation.
first of all,
that would ruin the vacation.
CrowdStrike didn't name Qihoo. They said like there are some
that was such a
reports.
stupid thing.
They didn't say like Qihoo is wrong. No. So they didn't say that.
Adam Myers, if you're listening, when you're writing these reports and you want to be upfront and talk about transparency, like reference so we know what you're talking about.
Leave Adam alone. That was probably a fucking lawyer decision.
It's
not Adam deciding that. It's
this
some
is
idiot
typical
counsel.
politician thing, right? Politicians are trained not to name their rivals. So like when people were talking about Snowden, they were calling him that guy. Or they were talking about Navalny, they were saying this guy
The
or
SharePoint
that guy.
admin.
So it's that company, not Qihoo, right? 360. So that I thought that was weird, like not naming the company. It would be nice to at least say like, yeah, if you have full confidence that their report is wrong, then you say we have full confidence that Qihoo's report, not like there are some reports on the market that are probably wrong. And the other thing, what I saw is that people were saying that a simple read, like a simple memory access, right? A read operation cannot be turned into code execution, which is wrong. I mean, yeah, of course, you can just set up the stack properly in advance, and then the read operation, the read just triggers an exception, and the exception, gets your code executed because you set up things properly in advance. So I wouldn't say, again, I don't want to pinpoint fingers here or say who is right and who is wrong, but I think the next steps, one, CrowdStrike should acknowledge the Qihoo report and say it's wrong, and Qihoo should release a POC. And
to be honest, I have a bigger problem with this thing, which is I don't really give a shit if Qihoo is right or wrong. I don't give a shit if it's exploitable in that way. I think this is all a sideshow, and all of the technical explanations have been a sideshow to just acknowledging the flaws in the software update delivery architecture. And that's the real culprit here. I actually don't super care about the
deliberate
technical
noise?
details. Yeah, look, I think I'm not saying deliberate noise. It's not conspiracy Ryan time. It's more like opportunistic sideshow. You go, oh, thank you for giving me this clearly wrong claim that I can spend the next 2 weeks refuting. Where it's like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. I don't
I
care how the
disagree with you.
crash.
I
I don't
think
care how the crash.
we pounded these vendors to release technical documentation and everything they know
No,
that can
it's
help us
fine.
understand things.
It's
And then you say
fine,
you don't
Ryan.
care if they do.
No, 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 no. Hear me out. I want all the stuff that they've released, but it is an asterisk on top of whatever the software architecture, the software update architecture is, because that's the real problem. And that's, once again, the topic of 2 episodes already, but like that is what differentiates the it could happen to anyone element of, you done fucked up with an update. That's the difference between you don't fucked up with an update to your server farm, to your testing environment, to your small beta canary group of people versus you don't fucked up with 10 million machines or however many machines it was. And that's what bugs me about the sideshow of it. That's what bugs me about focusing entirely on the bug as opposed to saying, yeah, 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 look, this is why it fucked up and this is how it works. But really, the problem here was that some PM told us that this wasn't a priority for us to figure out how we rolled out these patches 3 years ago. So we've been raw dogging the like update mechanism for 3 years, and thankfully nothing bad had happened, and then the inevitable did. Like that's the race condition here, is it's a priorities race condition for some fucking PM who was playing with fire and it caught him.
Fair. I want to just get back to the Qihoo thing though, because I feel like it just was swept under the carpet because Adam says it's not exploitable and there is no POC. Costin says, hey, it's up to these guys now to release a POC. I believe it's very, very dangerous to discard what Qihoo 360 is saying. These guys have a reputation for being technically brilliant. We've seen that in the past. And when I read Project Zero description of one of the NSO bugs, I remember talking about a virtual machine within a font engine that was masquerading as a PDF file. And I'm saying, hey guys, you guys have no idea what these guys are capable of doing. Costin, am I crazy?
Well, I was thinking that what was missing from the Qihoo report, and by the way, what I thought was interesting in the Qihoo report, they were saying like something like 23% of the computers in China were affected, and to me that was like a huge number, scary. The fact that so many
What?
computers in China would be running CrowdStrike, well, that was unusual, like kind of strange, right? Yeah. But what was interesting there, they were saying that there's a possibility for EOP or RC, but again, they were saying like in what context. So if what it takes for this to be, let's say, exploited is for you to deliver a custom channel file, right? Your own version of that channel file. Then to actually to write the file in there and to get the a driver to actually load and interpret it, then you will need system rights anyways. So if what you actually gain from that is essentially kernel mode code execution from system rights, then I would say it's not that spectacular. It would be a lot more spectacular if it was like a fully remotely controllable. But to me, it sounds like what they're saying is you can execute code in kernel space by being able to write files with the system/administrator rights.
Guys,
POC
I'm sorry.
or GTFO?
No, Ryan, we're looking at this all wrong. They submitted the POC to the Chinese government. We're just waiting for it to come back
We waited for it to be cleared. We waited for it to be cleared for the MIIT database. Yo, shout out to Kristen Del Rosso, because this thing there, my brain went to when you mentioned that the fact that these databases have been scrubbed and there's been a lot of manipulation of public availability of this data, that you can't track anything reliably anymore with these Chinese
Kristen's a
databases.
G. She did that for the first LABScon 2 years
Oh,
ago.
yeah.
It was a fantastic talk. But yeah, there's a big disparity there.
We're an hour in, and I got one last topic. Do you guys got another 15 minutes? Let's touch quickly on what is, and I use this word loosely. So, Ivan RC, if you're listening to me, don't scream at me too loudly. But starting to see balkanization in tech as a real thing actually happening. back in the old SAS days, we always had one of these live debate panels that had the single word balkanization, and we had people debate what it meant and what was likely to come down the pike. We're starting to see it now. Russia's blocked Signal. They've blocked iOS. They've warned of YouTube, iOS, Android. We mentioned this on the previous episode about secure operating systems. This seems like where we're headed, Costin, where every major power will have their own stack, their own tech stack for their use. Does this surprise you now, or this is just wartime posturing?
I mean, there's been discussions of Russia even disconnecting from the internet back in the days, if you remember, just testing, getting disconnected from the DNS, like the global DNS, the main name system, working like purely with just root domains and so on. So they've been doing this for some time, I guess. Probably all of this is in their advantage. So if you want to control the population, if you want to use disinformation, if you want to essentially influence the masses, then all that is in their advantage. What are you going to replace? I don't know, YouTube.
That's what I'm asking you. What are they supposed to use if they don't use iOS or Android, for instance? Let's go down to the mobile platform level. If there's balkanization there, what are these people using?
I guess that they'll either fork their own, so start building their own operating systems, either from scratch. And I think that theirs has been for a couple of years. Kaspersky OS has been in development for over 20 years, if I remember correctly. So probably slowly but surely, and there must be some kind of a plan behind it. They're developing homegrown alternatives.
That's giving the Russians a lot of credit. Like,
are there Chinese options though? Are there Chinese alternatives? Xiaomi and these guys, are those realistic options? Or do you think that this drive for a multipolar world means we have to have our own?
I think that, if I can just make a parallel, here is when the European Union banned cheese in Russia. Like it's kind of funny and sad at the same time, but like suddenly a lot of restaurants in Russia, they no longer had access to quality cheese, camembert, brie, all these types of cheese that go into everything, like pizza, into pasta.
Oh no!
So they started developing them. They started developing like their own types of cheese. It took time. It took like years, but like in 2-3 years, they had like some alternatives ready. So I think that this is like something that they are experienced with.
Costin.
Technology is harder.
Making a mobile operating system is hard. Like Google still hasn't gotten it right with Chrome. They're patching over these every freaking week. I mean, like,
I'm too busy trying to come up with a clever cheese joke for the Russians. But no, look, I agree with Ryan on the. I think it's giving them way too much credit to say they have a plan. Like, to me, this felt more like it was hand in hand with the whole like, let's get rid of all of the frontline people's personal devices that have been like a massive source of like OPSEC fails in the front lines, which is kind of hilarious, right? Like you see these pictures of like people's phones having gotten shot, which is, I mean, I think it highlights the kind of penal colony element to being conscripted in the Russian army, and like, God help those people, right? Like, a lot of those folks are not true believers. They've just got fucking drafted and they're in a horrible situation. But when it comes to technology adoption, I think the Russians still have that like centrally managed economy mentality where you can make an arbitrary decision in the center and you don't give a fuck if people starve to death because that's not the way that you distribute grain or whatever. I think we're seeing a similar mentality with this phone thing, because if there was a plan, you would be telling me, come hand in your Android phone, we will flash it to this other thing, or come replace your whatever phone and here's this other thing, because technology is supposed to be an important part of a functional economy, people being able to reach each other and whatnot. To arbitrarily say the two largest phone operating systems are now no longer welcome here, and everyone's sitting around going, okay, so what are we using?
That's my question. Where did they go?
if you're not putting out a clear plan to your population and enabling it somehow, then this is either one of these complete bullshit measures that is just meant to make everybody continue to do what they were doing but living outside of the law, which is typical like Soviet style tactic, right? Everyone's a criminal in this system and it'll be okay until the day it's not okay. And we can use that to arbitrarily throw you in prison. Or it's just a thinly veiled cover for we're going to go shoot everyone's personal devices so that it's no longer quite so easy to find Russian troops that a bunch of kids in a Discord on Bellingcat know exactly where all of your deployments are. Like,
Right.
That's my thinking.
You think it's a real attempt to root out Western technology out of Russia entirely, Costin, and replace it? Or this is just a lot of wartime signaling?
Well, I think for many years there's been a lot of efforts in Russia to develop homegrown alternatives to Western technologies, from routers, from operating systems, from Office, like Microsoft Office alternatives, from alternatives
Search
to
engines,
Gmail,
Yandex is a big success
Mail.ru,
story, yeah?
Yandex, exactly. So there's a lot of homegrown alternatives, and I guess the philosophy here, it helps the economy to have these local alternatives to Western products. They don't have to send the money outside the country and so on. And obviously, they're easier to influence. So if you need like access to data or the ability to change or to influence something, is much easier than, let's say, putting pressure on Google or Microsoft to do whatever. So I think that, yeah, it's all part of the plan, in my opinion. It's been happening for a couple of years, probably more than 10. And I think that we're going to
5
see
years from
more
now,
of these
all three of
restrictions.
these, in 5 years, you think all three of these big, China, Russia, India, have all their own, basic tech stack? Or do you
I
think
have
this
far
is just
more
wishful
faith.
thinking?
I have far more faith. Like, the Chinese can definitely do it. I don't think the Russians can do it. That's my
Indians
personal
might be able
belief.
to do it too.
Yeah, I won't speak to the Indians, but I think the Chinese can do it, and to some extent have even kind of already done it. It's just not an enforced thing. They don't, necessarily care on that level. I don't think the Russians can do it. I think between the brain drain and, frankly, like the lackluster results that you have seen of people trying to develop this over the past 10 years, not to mention the fact that there is no implementation plan whatsoever, it right there and then you're seeing that I don't think that's going to happen. Does that mean that you can't have greater balkanization, that they won't be able to unplug from the internet if they wanted and so on? No. That's a completely different circumstance. But at this, like, going at this low a level of saying we're going to change your phone operating system, I think it's just a stupid way to go about this. Like, try to control the internet, try to control the telcos, try to control the protocols, try to control things that you can centrally manage. But unless you're providing some available for everybody alternative, this is an impossible measure that you're demanding of folks.
It's normal to expect like Russian governments to root out iOS from its networks, though. I mean, after triangulation, you have to imagine they're figuring out going in another direction. I mean, they have data to protect and assets to protect. Costin, what do you think?
Well, two things here. One was that I remember an old story from the communist times. So the
These are
story
my
goes
favorites.
that you'd go to a market in Moscow, and there were people selling light bulbs that were burned, like broken light bulbs, essentially. And like somebody asked, like, why are you selling? And they were actually selling for, I don't know, let's say 10 cents. And why are you selling burnt light bulbs? And there's like, it's easy. If you work in a state institution, you buy one of these for 10 cents. You go to your room, you plug it, take the good light bulb out, you put the broken one, and then you call maintenance. They come, they replace it, then you take the good one
have a
and
new
you
light
sell
bulb
the
for
good
your
one
home.
in the market. And this is how
I love
economy
it.
works. This is how economy works in communism.
This is how
the other
economy
story
works.
is in Romania in the old times. Essentially, all the factories depended on each other. So when for instance, there was a factory making tires for cars. and they were like pushing and pushing to increase production. And somebody was saying like, yeah, but still a car uses only 4 tires. Like if we increase the production, where are the tires going to go? And they said like, it doesn't matter because in communism, they will just force the company that makes cars to buy more tires from you. And when the communists collapsed, essentially the whole system collapsed, and they stopped buying all the extra tires because they didn't need the extra tires, and they just started buying tires from the West, which had
it's hard to think
better
that
quality.
This have to do with triangulation.
It's hard to think that a mechanism like that would collapse. It just seems so well put together.
Costin, story time.
Well, no. So I think to Costin's point, and I do see where his point is coming from. There's a fantastic book called "How Not to Network a Nation," and it's about the Soviet attempt to mimic the internet, or post-Soviet, I guess. It definitely recommended. Like it gives you a good sense of why this shit doesn't work. Why like these sorts of environments where it's not the communism of it. It's really sort of the
corruptness of it.
It's the bureaucracy that thrives in that environment of like ticking a box. What Costin just described is, hey, someone told us to make more tires. And then so check that box. Someone will force someone to buy tires. Check that box. Is there a necessity, a use, a utility, a common sense? No. But there is some central disposition that these things be done. And it turns out that you can like, there's a reason that lemmings are such a great analogy for this sort of like I'm trying to remember what the right term is for like a state where bureaucrats thrive, other than a state. But
it's called government.
Yeah. Well, there is a version of government where it's like just by the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats, and no one else. But essentially, that's where you don't get any kind of innovation, and you don't get a proper rollout plan. And that's why I said this is very in line with what the Russians do. You can arbitrarily set a measure like this with no implementation plan, and all it's going to do is sow chaos in the beginning and then force people to live exactly the way they've been living, but outside of the law. And it will not matter until the day it matters, until the day they want to pick you up in particular, and they go, well, why, what did he do wrong? It's like, well, he was on Android. Everyone in the room is on Android, but my God, I'm shocked to find out that folks here are using Android phones.
All right, let's leave it right there. Costin, Raiu, best of luck in Taiwan. Take a picture of the Supermicro factory for me.
I'll bring a chip for
man.
you. Okay.
Yeah, bring us some
Juanito,
super
what's next for you?
Taiwan magic. I'm actually theoretically home until LABScon, which is nice. I am going to try my best to actually do some research work so that I don't blow my brains out. And hopefully we'll get some good stuff rolling for LABScon.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, Costin, for staying up and interrupting your vacation for the people. The people appreciate it. The audience appreciates it. We got a new logo for the podcast that's going to go up pretty soon. I'm very excited about that. And with that, we'll say bye to the folks and catch you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.